I just wanted to talk about major forms of relief that are the things we encounter or so far have encountered most in our cases that you're likely to see. And the most important one, I mean, Glenn has been talking about already, which is asylum. And there are various forms of relief related to asylum that are less generous but easier to get. But we'll focus on asylum. Asylum, as you know, is for folks who are already in this country, as opposed to refugee status, which are people outside the country who want to come in. The standard is the same, a well-founded fear of persecution based on one of 5 protected categories: race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. The one that we tend to wind up with most often is particular social group because our clients don't fit into the easy ones to win, right? I mean, race, religion, et cetera, are much easier to establish. They're kind of objective characteristics. You got them or you don't. But the particular social group is a pretty elastic concept. And so a lot of our energy goes into identifying, defining, and sometimes making up these particular social groups to get the claim. You've got to show that you're in one of these protected groups. Then you've got to show that you are the victim of persecution. Usually government, but it can be non-governmental if the government is somehow complicit or completely incapable of responding, right? So if the government has sort of stepped away and let the gangs run your region, they've acquiesced, and the gang is the de facto government, and if you're persecuted by the gang because of one of these protected statuses. Critical thing you've got to show is, the legal term is nexus, but it means because of, that you're not being picked on because they don't like you. You're being picked on because you are a member of one of these 5 protected classes. Doesn't have to be the exclusive reason, but it's got to be a predominant, an important reason. And then, of course, the critical thing is establishing the conditions in the country that pull all this together. And you've got to show the conditions as they existed at the time you left, as well as if you were the victim of past discrimination, there's a presumption that you are still likely to face persecution if you're sent back. But that presumption can be rebutted by the government. So we have to be prepared to say, not only were the conditions terrible when I left the country in 2010, they're even worse today because, right? The 5 classes are race, religion, nationality, particular social group, and political opinion. Political opinion can also be pretty dicey to prove. I don't think we've had any of those cases yet. So that's the main one, right? Asylum. Second one is closely related to asylum, and it's a motion to reopen based on changed country conditions. So many of our cases have been adjudicated way in the past and have been unsuccessful. And of course, we can try to reopen those on a variety of procedural grounds or whatever, but there's also this thing that says, even if you didn't make it back then, now that you're here, if you can show that conditions have substantially changed, it's a claim that you're making based on new conditions not known, that didn't exist or were not known to you, reasonably knowable to you at the time you were originally denied, you get a second bite at the apple. So there, when we do the country conditions, we're actually having to establish sort of the prior versus the current, and being able to make the argument that the current is brand new and was not knowable, and we're entitled to raise it at this late date, and that we can't be sent back now, even if we might have been eligible to be sent back before. Third category of cases that we see is unrelated to asylum necessarily, but it can be for any reason that you're ordered deported. It's called cancellation of removal. And this comes in two parts. Part A deals with a waiver that generally deals with people who have these collateral criminal issues that present all kinds of obstacles to their getting any relief. We don't deal with that very much. Part B is the more likely for us, and here you qualify for relief if you meet a whole bunch of very strenuous conditions about how long you've been here and under what quality of life and so forth. Yes? That although you were scheduled to be deported, if you can meet the standard for relief, that is that you've been here for a very long time and you've behaved yourself, and you can prove exceptional and extremely unusual hardship, quote, exceptional and extremely unusual hardship, whatever that may mean, then they'll cancel, make void the prior order of removal, and you are eligible then for regularizing your status. The standard is extremely difficult to meet, and it's pretty wide open as to how you can address it. The Board of Immigration Appeals, which is the appellate arm of the immigration judge in Hartford that Glenn talked about, you go from there in the immigration court system to the BIA. They've ruled increasingly lately that you can bring up human rights dimensions to meet this test. Traditionally, there's a lot of economic hardship. And here the trick is it has to be absolute hardship. It can't just be relative. That is, we have a certain quality of life in Connecticut, and if we go to Ecuador, that quality of life will be diminished. Duh, right? That doesn't make exceptional and extremely unusual hardship. You have to show that the family can't survive, right? That the kind of medical care your son needs is only available in advanced society like ours, and if it's available at all in Colombia, is only available to the super elite, who can fly in doctors.
Yeah, I'm just going to stick a footnote in there. If you think, the way I've always explained it is that if you think about an international transferee for jobs, like someone who has to work abroad, or someone in the military who may get assigned to a foreign post, those family members would suffer a hardship, clearly. So if you start with that as a baseline, that's a hardship, but not an extreme and unusual hardship, and work from there. So that's just a tangible way maybe to have you think of the hardship standard.
Just a quick question to clarify. When you say, Dennis, that you have to show, for instance, such an extreme hardship that there would be, for example, a quality of medical care compromise, have there been any precedents on people on dialysis going back to countries where they can't get that service?
Yes, one of my early cases was with a woman from Honduras. I don't know if it's true now, but Honduras several years ago only had one part-time dialysis capable hospital in the capital. And the woman had actually been denied cancellation because they at least had one part-time dialysis. And I got it on an appeal. We won it, got sent back. Well, yeah, there's a lot that goes into it.
But it's something that kind of argument is very country and case specific for a lot of reasons.
Just what Bennett's saying, it's all case, it's got to be very specific.
Very specific. And by the way, under the prior law, the immigrant, him or herself, could suffer the extreme hardship. Under the current law, it has to be a child or spouse with lawful presence, U.S. citizen or
it can be permanent resident.
Permanent resident.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, could you just say that again?
The hardship cannot be to the immigrant, him or herself. It has to be to the spouse or child, and the spouse or child has to be either a permanent resident or a U.S. citizen. So it's very restrictive, but many of our cases are exactly that. So the Diana and Julian case, we have a child with a rare genetic disease being treated at the National Institutes of Health, had a bone marrow transplant. The odds of this child getting adequate medical care in the home country are zero. And so we believe that's a case where you could make that argument, right?
I'm sorry, can I just complete my thought?
Sure, in 2 seconds, please.
So what you're saying when you say the spouse or child is that someone with truly compromised medical status who actually marries an American citizen has a better chance if they can demonstrate hardship to that legal American citizen.
Yeah, their own hardship does not count at all.
All right, thank you.
They can die, and that's all right. It's the spouse or child that we're worried about. Yeah.
And in the instance of the child, is it not particularly dependent on the child's legal status?
It is dependent. The qualifying relative, the predicate relative, has to be either a U.S. citizen or permanent legal status.
Yeah, they can't even apply for the app. They can't make the
The
application.
bar is very high. Listen, I don't want to delay this any longer. Glenn did just mention, and I want to put on the table too, discretionary stays. While they don't get you the kind of relief that these other actions do, they're a critical part of our strategy, right? Because we somehow wind up in these cases where people are going to have to get on a plane tomorrow, and if we can't get a stay, we've lost our client. And so the country conditions and the humanitarian claim often depends on conditions in the home country, right? So it ties into that as well. It's a stopgap, and it may then lead to a more permanent solution down the road. I'm going to turn it back to Glenn so we can do the main event here.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, just a quick clarification on cancellation or removal. Unless they have that qualifying relative, they can't apply. So it's not even available. And there's only 5,000 visas a year.
Oh, we left out parent. I'm sorry. It's a spouse, parent, or child, just not the
spouse,
immigrant
parent, or
itself.
child.
So
They
if
could
you're
be
caring for some an elderly parent who can't do the cancer or dementia
Yep.
or something like that, you might be able to.
You might be able to pull in. But I just want to point out, again, I don't know how many lawyers we have in the room, but that's after 9 months. I feel like I'm doing a made-on-TV commercial or something. But really, that's less than 10 months of training, and my training, no less, which says something. So with that kind of as the background, when we talk about country condition research, we're trying to plug in factual support to asylum or cancellation of removal. And because of the limited time, I'm going to focus mostly on asylum, doing research to support an asylum case. But, and I could see a lot of interest in the cancellation, you still need country condition reports and so forth to support the cancellation side of things. But that's showing the hardship, as Bennett explained, to the qualifying relative, okay? So if I ignore for the presentation cancellation, it's there. It's just that it's oftentimes similar research, or it's the same research actually that you'd be doing for asylum. And asylum's a little more involved with the research. Yeah. Well, the PDF, yes. And I'm going to, just as a, I'm going to be going back and forth between the PDF and the website.
All the resources will be sent to you.
Yeah, you're going to get all these resources. And the other thing is we're going to do follow-up trainings, so I don't want people, I'm going to try and keep this underwhelming. I'd rather it be underwhelming for today than overwhelming. Two things, as you're doing the research on country conditions, you don't other than knowing the general framework to which you're researching, conducting the research, you don't necessarily need to have a lawyer's mind on it. In fact, the benefit is that in this room, I have a think tank that's like from, a dream. I mean, you all have different experiences, backgrounds, and you come to this with different perspectives. That is going to benefit the final product. And if you're working in a team, even more so, okay? So the goal, let me start with the goal of doing this research. I'm an immigrant. I'll use Guatemala, because I know a lot of the teams have been working with refugees from Guatemala. I'm coming from Guatemala. I left, well, let's start with I'm going to move this back, but it's very, specific as to what the case is. I left Guatemala back in the late 80s, following, the guerrilla wars and the death squads and everything else that most of you maybe remember from the nightly news back in the 80s and 90s. I came to the U.S. border fleeing that. In my home country, my family was being specifically targeted for extortion by guerrillas or paramilitaries. I maybe saw my father murdered in the front yard like a goat. You tend to get sort of a rare sense of humor when you work with this a lot, so I apologize up front. But, I saw my father murdered in my front yard. It was very traumatic as a child. I maybe saw rape of, my sisters by the paramilitaries. I was extorted. For these reasons, my family put money together with a coyote and sent me to the U.S.-Mexican border to cross. Maybe I crossed, and back then, I didn't get caught. I worked my way. I've come to Connecticut. I've met up with cousins and other family members, and I've established my life. I encounter ICE. ICE puts me in removal proceedings, and now I'm in front of an immigration judge. Now, I don't want to get into the weeds. You have 1 year from the time you enter the United States to file for asylum. You can show extraordinary circumstances to overcome that. But for purposes of now, and I'll do it on another presentation, I'll get more into the weeds of applying for asylum. You go in front of an immigration judge and you apply for asylum. Now that may have happened 20 years ago, Since I've left, I've stayed in touch. I've sent remittances to my family to help my local community. I'm cleaning houses, I'm working construction, whatever. Those family members have continued, in some cases, to be targeted by the old paramilitaries, or just gangs now are the big thing, which are paramilitaries turned into organized crime. They're involved, targeting family members. I'm standing in front of an immigration judge. I've paid some immigration lawyer $6,000 or $7,000 to represent me. The immigration lawyer meets with me and my family, or me and maybe one or two friends, and says, all right, I need you to get me letters, affidavits, I need country reports, news articles, get me whatever you can. You get it? You got it? Maybe in Spanish or native language, maybe not. Good. See you in 4 months. Immigrant walks out. He seemed like a nice lawyer. We just paid a lot of money. It's got to work, right? That's where the immigrant's coming from. So you go to, and I'm going to throw in little tidbits, and again, it's kind of in the weeds. Just listen and we'll talk about it later. I go to something called a master calendar. I stand up in front of the judge with my lawyer. The lawyer says, all right, counsel, to my lawyer, we're going to put this down for a merits hearing. Right now they're running about 1.5 years, 2 years out. See you in 2 years. I expect a supplemental filing, which is all of the documentation, to be presented by X date. Got it? Yep, got it. We go out in the hall, we talk to the client. Okay, remember I told you, you got to get me some support. Whatever your story is, get me some affidavits, get me some support. See you in 2 years. 2 years go by. You come in, and the lawyer's up there. He maybe printed out the country report by the Department of State. Maybe there's a news article, maybe like a single line letter from somebody back home from Guatemala that says, if he comes back, he's going to be targeted by the gangs. And then the lawyer puts him up on the stand and says, tell me about where you're from. When did you enter the United States? And he walks through this whole spiel, a little bit about the background. He says, okay, what happened back in 1994? Well, I saw my father murdered in the front yard, my sisters were raped, and I had to leave. The family put some money together and I went to the border. Okay, what else? Well, since, I've heard about some problems back home, my third cousin was targeted by a local gang, and I think if I go back, I'll be targeted too. Anything else? No. Judge cross-examines, trial attorney, which looks like a prosecutor, but it's not. It's called a trial attorney. May ask some questions, may look at it and think, God, this is so pathetic. I'm not even going to bother, because if I get out early and the judge deports them, I can maybe, add an extra hour onto my day and I'll get flex time at the end of the week. That's really how these asylum cases go. And the problem is the lawyer doesn't really have the time, and the client doesn't even understand what's needed. The judge is saying, give me proof. You know, that happened 20 years ago. How's that going to affect your life today? First of all, other than your say-so, what else can you show me that says you had problems back in your home country? And the immigrant's thinking about it, God, that was 20 years ago, you know, or 10 years ago, whatever it is. I'm using just one specific example, but you know, there's a variety of examples. So then it becomes, how do you support that claim? How do you show the judge and verify what was going on when you left 20-something years ago? Immigrants lost. And that's why most of these cases, especially from Guatemala and everywhere else, are losses. They just get, you know, the judge writes up a decision, or doesn't even write it up. It's an oral decision, denying relief, deported. That's where you guys come in. So the standard right now is like down here in terms of the quality of the representation. And I just want to put it out there, you know, so nobody thinks that I'm standing with wings and a halo. I don't have a lot of time. I don't charge $7,000, you know. You can't ask poor people to pay money they don't have. But I'm going to tell you that that's sometimes all you can do in a busy practice. You don't really have time to sit with a client and take a longhand affidavit and then to go do country reports and then go get, you know, psychological testing and all these other things that may prove the case, or even to brainstorm it. You know, I think we do a slightly better job. Try. I've got Nayeli from my office over there who works day and night to save people. But you do the best you can do. But with a support team and by doing these country condition reports, we can improve that. So the first thing to think about is Guatemala, 1994. Well, maybe we need to go back a little bit further. What was going on in Guatemala in the 1980s? And what region from Guatemala were they living in? Partly because, believe it or not, I'm terrible with phonetics. I'm going to pick an easy location in Guatemala. I looked it up, actually. Mixco. Am I saying that right, Nayeli? Mixco? M-I-X-C-O. Very easy. Mixco, it's also listed as one of the poorest cities in Guatemala. They lived outside of Mixco in Guatemala. What was going on in that region, and how would you access information about what was going on in that region at that time? Now, the resources that you would think about, because we now have Google, is Google. But where on Google do you look? News sites, you know, legacy news sites, third-party aggregation sites. You know, the one thing about Trump and this new awareness is that universities and groups are pouring in, and they're publishing, and hopefully someday will publish a website with all of this aggregate information about specific regions, specific countries, specific things that support immigrants. But think about it. They're up in front of the immigration judge in Hartford at their hearing, and they need to prove it. So go to Google. The first place I would tell you to start is go to Google and start the research process, okay? There are some sites, there are some baseline sites that you're going to want to go to, which the judge will expect to see in a package of country reports. And that's the Department of State country reports. Let me see. Let's see if my hyperlinks are working. These links are going to be given to you. I think it's working. Human rights reports. Now, over the years, every year, 70,000 Department of State employees go out and aggregate information about what's happening in specific countries. The judge expects that you will have appropriate country reports for the timeline. But they don't go back far enough. And one of the things I would tell you is, and again, a lot of this you're going to be like, you know, gosh, I thought we were coming to learn, and he's asking us questions or giving us challenges. I would love to have better access to the country reports from the Department of State in the 1980s. It's hard as heck to get them. I always struggle when I have an old asylum case, especially on something called a motion to reopen, and I got to go back and try and find it. I literally sometimes go and mine old applications that we may have filed back in the 90s or in the early 2000s, because I remembered we had country reports in them. That's how bad it is. Yep. I don't know, but can somebody look into it?
They may be hard copies.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure, again, if I wasn't chasing everything else in my practice, I could do a FOIA.
I was just going to say, have somebody do a FOIA request for the Department of State to get those reports to you. Go ahead, go.
But if you go to the Department of State, right now, this is in real time, you can go back to to 1999, it looks like they go back to. And then they're segregated by a preface. I wanted this to be as real time, but not that real time. And they will give you the preface, and they'll explain to you, back in a different era in America, we used to think this was important, and we funded it, and we did the research, and that just gives you why they're doing it. And then if you go back to, and they always run, obviously, a year behind. The appendices oftentimes will have useful intellectual information, but not necessarily very practical information. Okay. Yep. Good place to check. It's the American Immigration Lawyers Association. At some point, I hope we become a member organization of it. They do have resources that you can access. For whatever reason, I'm drawing a blank. There's on their website, if you're a member, they have research links. I find the research link at AILA, it's the shorthand, American Immigration Lawyers Association, not very helpful. I can never find anything. I always want to do Boolean search, and I get tons of crap that I don't need. Or they're looking to support membership, conferences and stuff like that. So.
No, I'm a member, and yet they still, want you to pay for the bound copy of the bill. There is some info out there.
Yeah. So Department of State Human Rights reports. The Department of State also, and we'll get into some of, I'll try to get into some of these country conditions reports. It's a detailed report, which used to be detailed report. Let me requalify it. Lately, the Department of State reports are very summary in nature. They don't go into specific incidences in the year. Maybe some, if there was a mass killing or a mass grave found, you'd find that buried in the text. But they're really going specific to that year, and they're talking specifically to the events happening in that year. You need it because that's what the immigration judge is looking for, or at least wants to see as part of an appendix that the immigrant's going to supply. I don't find them very helpful anymore. I don't know why, but for reasons beyond me, they're not as specific. I used to find them much more helpful 15 years ago. But I find them very general in nature. I also find them political in nature. When you really read them carefully, you start to realize that they're mentioning some things and not mentioning other things, and they're mentioning things in a certain way. And I believe, not because I'm middle-aged and have conspiracy theories, that there's a reason they're doing that politically to help or whatever. So, what? Yeah. However bad we may or may not feel about the current administration, we're all here now, and that makes me feel good. And that's all I'm focusing on, just positive energy. Another place for Resources is USCIS, but it's, the link is broken. See if I can do this. Yeah, it's not coming up. USCIS also has country information. Maybe at the end I'll try to link over to it. Helpful, I actually find it a little more helpful than the Department of State, but it is what it is. It's a government report. Human Rights Watch is a, let's see if that link works. Yep. They are actually very good. They will get into significant detail and will mention specific incidences that may happen in, specific regions. But remember the framework of what we're trying to do. I mean, some of this is overwhelming when you start reading the country reports, and then, if you're like me with a little ADHD, I get distracted. I'm like, oh, that's interesting. It has nothing to do with what I'm reading, but I find myself 15 minutes later, like on some tangent. Yeah. Yeah. Let me bounce that back at you. If you were handling the case, how would you handle it? Right. Right. And that's the reason I was doing that, not to call you out, but the reason I was doing that exercise, I wanted to do that with you, because that's exactly the voice in your head, or that's the discussion you're having in the group. Like any of the questions you may, and I want everyone to ask questions as we go along, it's more important to me. I mean, I can give you the websites. You don't even need to come today to get the websites. It's what you do with that information and how you use that information to help the specific client. Now, if I had this think tank with me on a specific case, I'd be throwing out ideas to you and be, good, get back to me. It'd be wonderful. It'd be like having 50 associates in the office, that I'm not paying for. Now you know my motives. But I mean, all of this stuff when you're reading it, unless you're like me and you get on a tangent, intellectual tangent, just ask those questions. Like, how does this thing from 2018, that really has nothing to do. It's nice to know what's going on now. That's a segment of what we're trying to accomplish. Yeah. Yes, I'm getting to that. Right now, we're working from the outside in. Yep. They don't, and then, as we get to the bottom, it's like, what do you do with this information, right? So we're like a funnel right now, pulling it down to pour into a bottle. That's the issue. What do you do with this stuff? Because I'm going to tell you what I do on a lot of cases that aren't well supported is I take the client's affidavit. I should have mentioned that. You always get a detailed affidavit, or I should have emphasized it, from the client. Tell me exactly. And some of the teams that have worked with some of the cases have amazingly detailed, multi-page affidavits. And then you start with that affidavit, and then you link, the NGO to paragraph 18 of that affidavit, because that's like a support for what the client's saying, okay? That's getting a little ahead, but I want to make sure that that's clear. Under Human Rights Watch, so we go in here, and we go down to, where are we? Americas. We got Guatemala right here. And then when we come into here, I remember this website when it was really just basic, and I actually think it was easier to use when it was, basic. You'll go into the reports, but what they have, and the thing I wanted to point out to you, other than sort of their official annual report on a country, is they oftentimes have current articles and news. And that can be more helpful than the overview. So when you go on some of these websites, and I encourage you afterwards, with your iPad or your laptop or whatever, fumble around with it and just see the different kinds of information. I mean, I could spend hours going into the layers that these websites have. I do find that some of them are just, again, for someone with ADHD, distracting, because I'll see this and I'll be like, oh, I want to find out what he's doing with the Americas division. But when you're working on something specific, you're going to see a lot of this. And this may not be a good example because it's not giving you anything that's specific. I mean, can everybody read this? Running out the clock, how Guatemala's courts could doom the fight against impunity. If there was something in the story, the immigrant's story, about how he was being targeted following a court case, this might be relevant, if you see what I mean. But if you're just talking about, in our model, something that happened back in the 90s about the death squads, really has nothing to do with the courts, unless you can make that link, spare it. Maybe save it if you think you have another case coming up, or it's just in your curiosity folder. Link it over to there and come back to it later. I should mention that as you work on these things, you will find, and I have different folders on my computer, I'm just like, that's an interesting, I'll never find it again when I need it, so I put it over there. And then quite honestly, I can't find it once I've saved it, because then I'm searching my hard drive. All right, so that's Human Rights Watch. Amnesty International, I'm not that concerned. Years ago, this was the go-to site. You put the Department of State and you went to Amnesty International. In every asylum case, without fail, I used Amnesty. And I do give money to Amnesty, but their country reports really aren't that helpful anymore. They're just not. And I don't believe, for whatever reason, the immigration courts really give them a lot of weight and credibility. There's stuff, there's like political stuff out there about, how they do their country reports, that they're very biased, they're very anti-American, or whatever. I would still go to it. It's just that I know a lot of people sitting in the room may have come into the room. If I had asked, I should have, what are the sites you would naturally gravitate to? Amnesty International would pop up. Amnesty International is a wonderful thing. Someday I hope maybe they join us with bring attorneys to the table. But in terms of the country reports, in terms of doing it, it's important to look at it. I just don't really cite them anymore. In fact, I'm actually not even including them with a lot of asylum cases.
One suggestion is if you find something compelling in the Amnesty report, then go find another,
that's an excellent point.
source that you can cite, just like the crazy conservative internet blogging thing that goes on, right?
Right. Well, it gets to another layer. I was about to say, don't be afraid to go to Fox News and look for reports. Generally in Hartford, we have two brilliant immigration judges. I'm not saying that because they may hear this and I have to appear in front of them. They really are good. We have good immigration judges. Judge Strauss can be tough on relief, but he is a genius and probably the smartest man on immigration law, or person on immigration law in the country. He's just not very easy with relief. And Judge Verillo is excellent as well, and he's actually very compassionate. If you're supporting someone, for instance, up in the Boston courts, which has a lot of different judges, with a lot of different backgrounds, it doesn't hurt to use some contrarian research and go to websites that would otherwise be conservative. And if you can find something positive, that's a bona fide, to it. That even on the Fox News site, they're talking about, this. These are just different parts and different things to keep in mind as you're going into country reports. The UN Ref World is, sorry, I think that's a broken link. Get down here. Here we are. This website is excellent. And when I show you a report, an actual report from it, this will be exactly what you want to have in a report. So you come down here, and these are specific for asylum seekers. And I would encourage everyone, if you wanted to, like, besides a Department of State report, it's going to come up easy. 59-page report specific to the year 2018. They actually don't go back this far with this kind of detail. I think this is only in the past 7 or 8 years. So you can look, but I don't think they have this going back to the 80s and 90s. I could be wrong. They are doing great work. And at the end, when we talk about a template, I mean, this is crazy. I mean, table of contents, 59 pages. But this is what I want to show everybody. When you get into the bodies of these reports, look at this. Footnoted with links. And let's see if I can I blow this up? Well, anyway. I don't want to mess too much because this computer is working and I haven't had any glitches. So to demonstrate one page, I'm playing it safe. They footnote and reference other sources. And at the end of the day, that's what we will need to do if we're supporting an appendix to an immigration judge. How are we doing on time? We're running late. All right, I'm going to move it along. But this is an example of what to do with the, a country report where it's showing you everything it's saying is footnoted in reference to something else, to another site.
I suggest you might show people the sites on
Yep.
17 at the end.
Yeah.
Consider the whole good site.
Let me, I'm going to cover that in 1 second. I'm actually going to show you an appendix. You're going to get direct links to country reports and sites. So when you get this, you can, and you'll have it in this format. All you have to do is click. That's broken. So it'll take you to the Department of Justice website, which is a great page to work on, because they have a lot of aggregated country reports going back, and those are what the immigration judges use.